Happy New Year to all of our listeners. I'm probably too late in saying that, but there we go. We had a short break from recording over the Christmas period, and we kick off the new year and the new season of the Activist Lawyer podcast with an interview featuring family law expert Anne Marie Featherstone. Just a little bit of background on Anne Marie. Anne Marie is a solicitor at Rafferty and Co Solicitors in Newry, and she will be sharing insights into her legal career and her journey to specialising in all areas of family law. Her experience includes working on the Law Society for Northern Ireland Children Order panel, working on the Court Children Guardian panel and on the Hague Convention panel for the abduction of children. Anne Marie has a Master's in Human Rights and Criminal Justice and has great familiarity with the courts in Northern Ireland and the needs and assistance required for those who find themselves seeking support and guidance in the family law arena, to include the area of domestic violence. So in this important conversation that I was particularly keen to have with Anne Marie, we delve into the legal system's response to domestic violence. We focus a large part of our discussion today on that. And that is particularly timely given the alarming number of women who have lost their lives due to violence in the UK, but specifically in Northern Ireland over the past year and beyond. So hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. Excuse me for being a little bit hoarse. And please share and review our episodes as always, and enjoy today's conversation. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Anne Marie has just popped around the corner from Rafferty and Co Solicitors to join us. It's great to have a local solicitor in the office in the studio today. So thanks for joining us. We're going to talk a little bit about your work and focus on a particular area that both of us are interested in. So thanks for making the time to come today, Anne Marie.
No problem at all. Thank you.
All right. So going back in time a little bit, I'm going to ask you a question we ask all of our guests is, what inspired you to get into law? How did it all come about? And maybe you could take us a little bit through your training and background.
What inspired me to join law? I actually commenced university studying medicine. So I had done 2 years of medicine. And to be totally frank, at that time, I lived in a house with a number of individuals who did courses with a lot less hours. And I was very intrigued that I was in every day doing homework every night.
No.
And felt that there had to be an easier way. And ultimately, aside from that, I do joke about that. Ultimately, I didn't want to be a doctor. And I thought, law would be interesting, and inspired, I think, by Tom Cruise and A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
And
watched it recently.
a combination of that and Ally McBeal. And I had an interview with the Dean when I was still in medicine, and he said, that's absolutely fine. You can transfer across and give me a place in the September. And I did my degree in law and politics and didn't look back.
Very good. Where was this you studied?
In Queen's. In Queen's in Belfast.
Very good. Wow, so 2 years of medicine though. My goodness. Yeah. I actually have heard the opposite. People who did 2 or 3 years of law and then transferred over. I know quite a few people who did that. But it's that kind of relationship between medicine and law that you wouldn't really make that connection, which is unusual. But anyway, and then you specialise in family law primarily. Have you always done that, or what led you to specialise in that particular area?
Well, when I was completing my apprenticeship, so to become a solicitor you do your degree for 3 years, and then obviously you do your training, which I did at the Institute of Professional Legal Studies in Belfast, and then as part of the training to become a solicitor you do an apprenticeship. And during my apprenticeship, largely I was involved in family work, right. Because I was helping and assisting in largely a solicitor who needed family work covered, and I got great experience. And I suppose that's where my interest developed. I then went on and did a Master's in Queen's in Human Rights and Criminal Justice. Which again was quite interesting. And I did my dissertation actually on the youth court at that time, when at that point, it's been in a long time now, but the new juvenile justice programme had been set up implementing restorative justice into Northern Ireland, and I did a dissertation on whether that did it infringe upon children's rights in essence. So doing my work every day, then I have learnt to specialise in essence in family.
And it's not it's quite a varied area as well. And we haven't had too many people on who primarily work in family. We did have somebody who works in England doing family law, which is somewhat different in terms of how things operate here. But for anybody listening who's interested in it, what type of work would you have on your desk at the minute? What kind of issues are you seeing arising within that kind of broad area of family law?
So in terms of family law, it ranges from what we call private law and public law. Private law, in essence, would be applications to the local court and higher courts to do with contact. That's contact arrangements between parents and non-resident parents and their children, residence applications, maybe a prohibited steps application if somebody is trying to remove a child to another country. We will have applications about whether there should be sole residence, or what people refer to previously as custody. That's the sort of general work regarding children. You would also have public law applications, and what that is when the state feel that they need to intervene and potentially share parental responsibility. Obviously a certain threshold has to be met of significant harm in those cases, but they would be quite complex. And
I'd imagine,
yeah. And, very challenging for people who are involved. I am on the Children Order panel through the Law Society, and I'm also on the panel for the Court Children's Guardians. So in certain cases of public law, the court will appoint a Court Children's Guardian, who is an independent social worker who comes in and looks at the case from a children's perspective. And then at that stage, they appoint a solicitor. So I'm on that panel as well. So I would be involved in a lot of cases across different courts, which would involve children who have been removed, are being removed, potentially being freed for adoption. So there's a whole catalogue of cases. And I suppose as well, in my general day, you also have people coming in for advice about separation, divorce, agreements about finances, maintenance. You have people coming in about what we call Mariva injunctions, when somebody's doing something they shouldn't be doing, in terms of the matrimonial pot or assets. And I suppose most importantly, and what we're here today to talk about, is you'll have people coming in who clearly need emergency assistance to do with domestic violence and needing advice, support, help regarding what we can do to assist.
Gosh, tough work, but really valuable as well. And I suppose to have that expertise, it builds up over years and years, and you've probably seen some changes in some of the areas that you work in. And I'd imagine working on the child protection matters is quite difficult, but you're liaising with so many different departments and agencies as well. So it's almost like a team effort, I suppose, to get the results that's best for...
At times, yes, absolutely. I suppose in essence, firstly, your experience builds up over time. There's no doubt about it. You learn something new every day, and that's important to be open to that. Absolutely, strategies have changed. A lot of the time we do our very best to work collaboratively with other statutory agencies, whether it be the Trust, police, and the other agencies like Women's Aid.
Yes.
At times we have to bring challenges to those agencies because perhaps their steps aren't warranted or aren't justified or are too far or disproportionate. So we have to be alive to all of those things. Yeah, gosh.
Well, look, you did mention there an area that we're going to speak about, and it's something, Anne Marie, we're both from this part of the world, and we've heard horrific news, especially in the lead up to Christmas. But over the last number of years, and anyone listening, just to kind of put some context behind this, since 2020, 25 women have lost their lives in Northern Ireland due to violence, with 7 of these tragic deaths occurring in 2024 alone. I think that year has been particularly horrific. And disturbingly, many of these killings took place in the victims' own homes. And it's well documented, I suppose, that in most cases of abuse, serious harm or murder, the perpetrator is someone the victim knows. That's quite well established. And each of these deaths underscores the urgent need for action to happen. And as we think about these women and we think about the losses, we're acutely aware of the devastating impact that it has had on families and communities. And we see there's so many people come out to hold vigils, but the anger's mounting now. People are becoming frustrated at the sheer volume of killings in this part of the world. And advocacy groups such as Women's Aid, which I mentioned before I'm on the board of, have been vocal, I suppose, in urging the government and lobbying to collaborate with institutions to combat this violence against women and girls. But we spoke a little bit about this before we started recording. A huge problem is funding and resources. and we really need to put more pressure on various institutions to look into that. Now, we do have a strategic framework to end violence against women and girls, and that's been very welcomed throughout the community here. And we've spoken about that before on the podcast, the need for that to be put into place. But just from your perspective, Anne Marie, and focusing on your work and the justice system in general, how effective is the system, and how has support been for those who are reporting incidents of domestic violence? What does it look like in terms of your work?
I suppose really in terms of people who are reporting domestic violence, we have had groundbreaking legislation brought into effect from the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, which was largely implemented in 2022, which has brought into law a number of changes to include the crime, in essence, of coercive control. And I certainly have seen a number of cases where the domestic abuse limb has now been prosecuted, where I think previously it wouldn't.
Yeah.
I think in time we will see how successful that is. The conviction rates that were recently released wouldn't suggest that they are exceptionally high.
Okay.
However, when I say that, I think what I'd read was that the conviction rate was 55%, but there are a number of out-of-court disposals, which may be that people were putting their hands up and taking a caution or some other disposal. I have also done work for the Department of Justice and have sat as a chair for the Domestic Homicide Review. I think something that I largely think all of these ideas, strategies, legislation that are coming in are fundamentally good and are great steps forward. The problem is, as you've said, is implementing them and funding and resourcing them. I think there is a number, when we boil this down, these poor women have lost their lives. Why? And I suppose, what can we do to change this? What can we do to not make the same mistakes? And sadly, I think a lot of this is going to be down to education of our other younger generations in terms of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and what and who are out there to help, where you can get support, and making that opening everywhere, whether it be, they can confide in anyone and we can get support together. I think as well, that's one limb of it, looking at it from the victim's perspective, which is really, really important. But also, how do we stop these people becoming perpetrators? Yeah. And sadly, I think, I'm not saying in all the cases, some of these people have been part of the criminal justice system and opportunities have been missed. And I think largely we really need to look at, trying to fund, better organise our criminal justice and mental health systems, so that supports are provided to these people so that they do not reach the point where they are committing these atrocious crimes. Yeah.
And I'm glad we've the opportunity today to look at that and to get your perspective on it as somebody who's working within the system, because all too often we just see statistics, and it's only, as you said, these women, I mean, they should still be here, and there's a reason that this has been not allowed to happen but has happened, and we're sick of it. We're sick of it, and it really there's a huge gap there. There's something has to be done. But just looking at it, I mean, from a family law perspective as well, relating to anybody who comes and has reported domestic violence, I'm interested in finding out, what issues often arise for that person, because I mean, their whole life is being taken from under them, and very often, despite the fact that they've suffered years of abuse, once they leave that, I mean, that's not the end of it, And as you mentioned, coercive control there, that's a huge problem, and I'm glad to see that that's being reported on and acted on as well, and prosecutions have come out of that. Beforehand, no, that would never have happened. So that's good to see that recognised. But just in terms of, the economic control that somebody has, the fear of losing their children, which is something we discussed, what comes up? What's the first kind of thing that you see when somebody leaves the situation?
I think, and I've read research on this, that the inhibitors to why victims of domestic violence don't come forward is the fear. There's a stigma, right, number one, in terms of, and we all don't like change, and there is a general fear of that change. There is obviously an economic fear in terms of if the other partner is the primary earner, what we're going to do. There is generally a complete misconception that if I phone the police will become involved. If social services will then be involved automatically, and I will lose my children.
Yeah.
And the biggest misconception and fear is the fear of losing your children because you report this, and that is I think is one of the biggest inhibitors to people coming forward. Yeah. And there is that control and that genuine fear.
It's hard to break that cycle as well. Yeah. There's so much at play, isn't there?
Totally. And you would regularly find some people will come to the office maybe 5 or 6 times before they find the courage and the bravery to come forward and either apply to the court for a non-molestation order or an occupation order, or go to the police and say, I want to make a statement of complaint. Yeah. It's so challenging and it's a big step, but I have spoken with colleagues, and in 98% of cases, after a passage of time, people will say, I am so glad I am yet to meet somebody who says to me, I regret the day that I actually took that step forward. Some people will reconcile. Yeah. And sometimes when the other party gets the support they need, whether it be medication, whether it be mental health, whether it be counselling, whether it be, and it helps them as much as, and they just need that awakening moment. And if they're not going to change, then that individual needs to protect themselves and potentially protect their children, because staying in that situation actually amounts to failing to protect the children if they're victims of witnessing domestic violence and abuse.
Because it's not only, of course, I mean, it's the family is affected at large. Yeah. I appreciate this is very general, but in the past we've seen reports in the media on cases, usually quite high-profile cases of violence against women, where victim blaming is prevalent, and what we might refer to as myths and rape myths, for example, that tend to justify acts of violence. And we see that in various reports, but quite often that can make its way through the judiciary and through the judicial process. So I'm interested in maybe finding out where we're at in terms of progression when it comes to the victim being the centre of these issues on abuse or violence.
Well, I wouldn't do a huge amount of criminal work. I do some criminal work. So I suppose there is certainly, I'm qualified over 20 years now, I've certainly seen an improvement in terms of the victim support and the service that they provide to victims through the whole horrible court process. There's a number of applications that can be made that the victim can give their evidence separately, so that they don't have to sit in the same courtroom. Just on that point, one of the most atrocious things I have ever had to witness is I represented a lady who was the victim of domestic violence. She took a non-molestation order against the perpetrator. He chose to defend it. He represented himself, and he got the opportunity to cross-examine her. Oh God! And the judge was, at the time of this case, was exceptional, in that he knew he had to allow it, but he kept it very much in check and minimal. But he had the right to cross-examine her, and that is one of the things going forward. I know that the justice system and the review that's undergoing at the minute is that why should a victim be cross-examined by the perpetrator?
Unbelievable.
And that's still out there. So whilst I do accept, to answer your question, whilst I do accept there's definitely been positive changes in terms of supporting victims, I think there's a long way to go.
There is. And I mean, there has been training put in place as well. I remember just from working in the Women's Council in the South at the time, there was proposals for judges to be trained, solicitors as well, even who are working on this case, to be trained as well. So some positive steps, but as you said, a huge amount of work still to be done in the area as a whole.
Well, it's the criminal justice system is probably largely weighted to protect the rights of the defendant on the basis that it's better for 9 men to go free than one to be convicted, and in essence, innocent until proven guilty. And whilst I totally that underpins the criminal justice system, potentially we have gone too far to protect the rights of the defendant, and perhaps maybe the victims should have their own legal representation as opposed to just the prosecution service. But I believe, and that's all ideas that are being looked at the moment.
Interesting to see how that pans out. And just in terms of, you said you've been practicing for 20 years, a huge case load as well, and different cases, and I'm sure you've come across all different scenarios. Is there anything that stands out for you that you're particularly proud of about any achievements? A lot of people hate this question, but
I have to say, I did ponder about this in terms of that you might ask me that question. I suppose really, I've had cases in the Court of Appeal and thought I was going to have that moment of justice, and that music would start playing when the case was thrown out, and there was no music and there was no big crowd of press, and and yes, that was a big moment, and the press being there and asking you questions, you've been quoted, was very exciting. But to be frank, it's the impact that you make even on a much lower, when I say, not on the tiers of courts. I mean, when you have helped someone escape what they would fear is hell and get them out of it, and they come back to you. I've one particular lady who she fell on hard times, and a partner had left her mental health deteriorated, and she couldn't manage her children. The children were removed by the trust, and she had a hard time getting them back. But together she worked, she did what I suggested she do. She fully engaged, she was committed wholeheartedly. It was so difficult, but she got her children back. And she now does a bit of work for the trust, ironically, who she hated at the time. I'll not tell you what she used to call on social workers, but she now does talks to other parents to say, look, all is not lost. You can come back from this, to try to explain, look, this can happen. And every Christmas she sends me a picture of her and her 3 children. And I just go, and that actually, and I talk about this lady, obviously not stating her name or the children's names, but about the journey, and she was put through the ringer. Like, it was very, very challenging, and you can come out, and it was just such joy, and she's so happy.
Brilliant.
And sometimes it is not the big cases that are in the High Court or the Court of Appeal, or that there's a judgment or the press are looking to speak to you about. It's about, or there's a written judgment. We've had ancillary relief cases where there's been written judgments and they're still been cited. But it's, for me personally, it's about making that difference. It absolutely
is. Great answer. Yeah. And just, you mentioned that case. I'm sure you've so many similar cases as well, and people who come to you at a really low point, as you said, or people who are just vulnerable and maybe can't find the voice, and you're there to represent them. And on these cases that are challenging, and you also represent young people and children as well, how do you manage, and this is a question that we ask a lot of our guests, and everybody has a different answer, but just about managing those cases, your workload in general, and is it difficult to switch off, as they say, or how do you do it?
Yeah, no, certainly, and I'm sure you probably say the same yourself. It is difficult. There's no doubt it's difficult in managing a workload, trying to switch off. And I suppose what I have come accustomed to is the way I switch off is exercise. I have done triathlons, I've done cycle racing, and I embrace that culture and the commitment. And that is what, I'm not a great runner. If I go out for a run, I've forgotten about my problems by the time I come back, and it just gives me that switch off and that time out, and my head's clearer and I can focus better. So these days I go to the gym. I don't do as much triathlon or road cycling with older children who demand your time. But I think that's how because you could work around the clock as well, because you genuinely want to help people, but there has to be there's only so many hours in a day. And
you're no good to anybody if you're not able to take that time off, recharge the battery, go back in and start again. And absolutely. I think that's the only way to do it. But it's so funny, so many people who work in similar areas do say the same about exercise, that's how they kind of end their day or cope, or, it relaxes them in a certain way as well, and helps them to just kind of be more balanced, I guess, too. But it's important.
I do like to meet up with some of my colleagues and have a cup of coffee and say, oh my goodness, that judge has been very difficult or challenging, or did you read that new direction, what do they think, and I'm having a problem with this, can you help me? And having a good relationship with colleagues, even for help with precedents or just support or a second opinion. Look, do you think I'm crazy? I'm thinking of doing this. is invaluable.
It
So
is.
talking to your colleagues and realising everybody's in the same boat.
Yeah.
Everybody's under pressure, not just you.
I think that's really important advice, because a lot of people they put off maybe by working in certain areas of law because it's intimidating. But as you say, if you have a team behind you and you get to know colleagues as well that are practicing the same area, one thing I've learned at the start, you'd feel very intimidated and I don't know this, I don't really know. Everybody's in the same boat as you said, and everybody's learning because things change, the law changes, legislation comes in, and you just have to keep up on top of it, but we're all the same.
Absolutely. And the day you think you know everything about something is the day that you clearly do not, and there's something new there. And giving time to your colleagues when they need support, but then likewise when you need to run something past somebody, do it.
Yeah, exactly.
If any message can go out in terms of domestic violence, improvements certainly have been made, but I think the big problem here is implementation of what's been proposed and funding it.
Absolutely.
And more education for young girls and boys as to what to do and what is appropriate. And I suppose the one message, if anybody is out there thinking that they do need some support, speak to somebody.
Yeah.
It may, absolutely a solicitor is great, but speak to somebody. And I suppose one final thing I think might be a good way forward for the Law Society to consider is like a panel of solicitors, because I think there should be a certain level of knowledge in terms of domestic violence for people who practice in that area like they do in children order. And I think that there should be a certain panel of solicitors who specialise in this area, so people know who are the people who to go to, because some people who don't do this area work wouldn't realise the urgency of getting to court immediately to get an order or to protect somebody. So I don't know, I think that's something that the Law Society potentially could consider.
That's a good idea, and I think that is in place in England, is it?
I'm not sure, but in here we have our children order panel, which is you can go to those people on that panel clearly have done extra training and have been every couple of years we have to do an exam or additional training to stay on the panel. And I think domestic violence is equally as important.
It is, yeah.
And perhaps that would be a good tool to help the profession. Yeah. But people, if anybody, is just to speak out to somebody who can, and supports are there.
Final question on that is for anybody who's listening that's interested in following in your footsteps and getting into family law in general, what advice or tips would you have for them?
Manage your caseload. No, I think absolutely it is a very rewarding area of law. It is challenging, as I'm sure all areas of law are. I think absolutely, trying to do a bit of work experience to see is this the area for you would be invaluable. Yeah. And whether that be work shadowing a barrister who does family law or coming into a solicitor's office and doing a bit of work to make sure, because it is challenging and it can be, particularly in cases that are very, very difficult and children who have been treated, very, very poorly, it does take a toll. And I think you have to be that, it's not the area for everybody. No. But in saying that, I do enjoy it. And generally you'll find, I'm very, very lucky in Newry. We have a great group of local lawyers who we all can fight our corners when we need to, but ultimately, if you needed to run something past somebody or you wanted some assistance with something, we're all there for each other.
Brilliant. Well, Anne Marie, thank you so much again for joining me, and we hope to keep in touch and follow your work.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. Enjoyed it.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.